My goal for the next 30 minutes is to give you an overview of land governance in South Sudan and to talk a bit about land investments and what they mean in this sort of rapidly changing context of modern day South Sudan. And then hopefully at that point we can open the floor for discussion. And I know that there's a wealth of knowledge in this room from many different disciplines, and I hope that we can have a very broad, far-ranging discussion, and we'll try to tailor it to suit everyone's interests. So, South Sudan has what's sometimes characterized as a plural land tenure system. So it means it's used to mean that it has these coexisting systems of formal land tenure, customary land tenure. The formal system, on the one hand, is mostly in urban areas. It's based on individual land holdings. Individuals take out leases with the government. So there's no freehold, there's no absolute ownership. Everything is basically usage rights. It's administered through formal land administration institutions. Survey activities, land use planning. These are organized by state institutions. The documents are registered, it's written. It's a document paper-based system. And it's mostly in urban areas. The customary system, on the other hand, is located mostly in rural areas. Land ownership, land use, land is owned by the community in its collective capacity. So it's not individualized in that sense, but it's more of a collective concept of ownership based on customary land tenure. So the principles of customary law, which vary according to different groups in the country, are used to organize land ownership, land usage. It's unwritten, so these are principles which are passed down from generation to generation and gain meaning through their application, as opposed to being a rigid set of written rules that are applied. The rights are unregistered, so unlike some other contexts in South Sudan, community rights exist in an unwritten oral form or in a lived form, but they're not documented and registered in the way that formal land rights are, and it's not mapped. So you have these two contrasting systems, largely distinct from one another, and each with its own strengths and weaknesses, but for the most part they operate fairly well when separated. But then what you see is when the two systems come into contact with one another, that's where problems start arising. To give you some history, this system dates back to the colonial period. So South Sudan was administered by the British colonial empire starting around the turn of the 20th century. The region was administered through indirect rule, meaning that the colonial authority made use of the existing systems, traditional authorities, as the main institutions for providing social order. And with respect to land, this meant recognition of customary land tenure, or recognition of the authority of customary land tenure to negotiate these relationships among people in South Sudan. So what you had was typically in the few urban areas where the British administrators were located, there will be a little place where land is formalized and where land is managed through individual leaseholds in this formal process, along with whatever bureaucrats were there to help in the colonial administration. Then outside of that area where most of the people were living, land was administered through customary land tenure and through these unwritten rules. Of course, those land holdings were subject now to a set of colonial land laws, which gave the colonial authority the power to expropriate land, or it actually deemed all unregistered land to be the property of the colonial government, of the crown, or of the state, and gave the colonial authority the right, under color of law, I guess one could say, to take land and use it for various purposes, which they did in order to establish teak plantations, forest reserves, various types of development projects. So this sort of legal architecture was in place during the colonial period. In 1956, the British made a hasty departure from South Sudan and left power in the hands of a small elite in Khartoum, what's sometimes called a riverine elite, actually three small tribes in the center of the country, and South Sudanese were largely excluded from power. That precipitated a war, which lasted for the next 50 years intermittently. There are two phases to the Civil War. The second was the more costly phase from 1983 to 2005. It killed about 2 million people, both directly and indirectly through manipulation of food aid and hunger, famine, that kind of thing. And also displaced 4 million around the world to neighboring countries. Many went to Khartoum and sought refuge in various different places. Throughout this period, customary land tenure continued to be the primary means by which people access land, by which these relationships among South Sudanese were negotiated, which I think points to the resilience of customary land tenure, in addition to sort of the efficiency of a government not having to actually extend its bureaucracy throughout a very big country, which I think was probably the primary rationale for the British. This allowed them to administer South Sudan very cheaply and with a very limited presence. But yeah, it's also the resilience of the system is also, I think, something which throughout the war has been demonstrated. I should say that this wasn't only a state system. You also had a number of non-state actors that were operating in South Sudan at this time. So the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army, which is the primary rebel movement that was fighting throughout this second phase of the war. They also set up a sort of civilian administration at one point and passed their own laws. They had their own court system, and also customary land tenure was explicitly acknowledged as an important means of maintaining social order and of administering the country during the war. So around 2003, 2004, 2005, the peace negotiations began between the SPLM-A on the one hand, this rebel movement, and the government of Sudan on the other hand. In the course of these negotiations, the SPLM put forward a position statement saying that land belongs to the community in South Sudan. And this was seen as a sort of, in opposition to the government's position that land belongs to the state. And it was seen by the negotiators as a way of protecting the resources of South Sudan. So this is a very oil-rich country, fertile land. And this idea of land belonging to the communities for the SPLM was a way of protecting these resources from alienation by the government in Khartoum. So in 2005, we have the CPA is finally negotiated and signed and comes into force. And I think I wanted to share this quote to sort of capture the situation at that time. It's by an academic who also happens to be my father, but it's a good quote nonetheless. I'll read it briefly. In post-war South Sudan, customary law is being projected not only as a central element of the Southern identity for which the people fought, but as an important source of legislation, constitutionalism, and the rule of law for the government of Southern Sudan. There is, however, a gap between the positive rhetoric and practical measures for making effective use of customary laws postulated. So there are two, I think, things I wanted to draw out from this. First is that that customary law has gained an added significance in the post-CPA period, whereas during the colonial period and under Khartoum, the main rationale for this process of indirect rule or for formalizing or acknowledging customary law was expediency and efficiency. It's cheap and it relieves the burden on government. But now it's gaining this added significance as a liberation ideology and as embodying what the people were fighting for during the liberation struggle. And so there's this rhetoric that now gets introduced about building a nation upon our cultural values and recognizing the diversity of South Sudan, and which is very much juxtaposed against the Sudanese vision, which sees the country developing along Arab and Islamic lines. So those two things are introduced, but then secondly, there's this gap between the rhetoric and how to pull it across and pull it off in practice, and how to make it operationalize a system that's based on these customary principles. And into that gap, or from that gap, you see a number of problems arising in the post-war period. Communities on the one hand have taken this idea of land belonging to the community and cultural sovereignty and are reluctant to make land available, even for public purposes. They look to instances in which they did give the government land and it was misused. Maybe the government came and said they wanted to build a police training facility, and you look and the next day there's a string of hotels up on the land, and land being used for self-interested purposes. So they've become very reluctant to make land available for any reason. The government, on the other hand, is in dire need of land. It's a new government, even to establish offices. If you go to Juba today, you'll see all the ministries are found within a 4-block radius on top of one another. In some cases, ministries have to rent or lease housing from private citizens. Ministers are staying in hotels and paying $800 a month for rent because there is no housing for public service personnel. Soldiers, whether demobilized soldiers or active soldiers, can't find land for housing. There's millions of people returning from the diaspora and elsewhere who also are unable to find land. So it's caused this real fundamental problem between just getting access to land. Between this idea of the customary system really being embraced and people taking the idea of land ownership by communities very seriously to the extent where they don't want any government interference at all, and the need for land. And it's all made much more complex by the realities of the post-war period, where you see, in any post-conflict society, property issues are tremendously complex. The movement of populations during the war, all kinds of secondary occupancy claims. And in the South Sudanese context, you have a situation in which investment, be it public or private, was totally cut off during the war. And then in 2005, it began very abruptly, whether it started with banking and telecom and construction, and soon hotels started springing up, and mining, interest in mining began, and all of a sudden there are these people coming and trying to access land for various purposes in the midst of this sort of vacuum of, or this gap between the ideals of what they would like the nation to be and the lack of real practical measures or regulatory infrastructure in order to make it happen. So just to give you sort of a more bird's eye view of what the current status quo is, this is a map of the communities of South Sudan, of which there are about 65, or depending on what you characterize as a community or an ethnic group. Sorry, the colors don't come out so well in this slide, but I just want to bring home the point that it's often said about South Sudan that there's no terra nullius, or no man's land, that all land has an owner, in the sense that people retain the right to regulate its usage under customary law. So if one were to go to South Sudan, this is something that I think most people who go to the country for the first time notice, is that there are huge areas of land that look like they're not used. And if you're driving, you can drive for miles and miles and miles and not see a living soul. Or if you're flying over the country, you can just see wide swaths of land with no one, maybe a few huts here and there, but very few people. And indeed, the population density of the country is about 1/3 the population of Uganda, across an area that's 3 times the size of Uganda. So a much smaller population, a much more big area of land, similar population density to Congo or to Norway. So we're talking about a very sparsely populated region. But in terms of ownership, communities do maintain ownership to virtually all of the land in the country, if one looks at sort of customary law and what people within their own view see as their land.
David, on the map, the country flag on the bottom, what are the donors in South Sudan?
That's a good question. It's too small for me to read, but I can see from many of those flags that they do look like a few of the donors. This map is from UN OCHA, which is the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Activities. And it says explicitly that this isn't meant to sort of recognize any land claims. And I don't know where they actually found all these, decided where to draw the lines from. But that being said, it does match with what people say in terms of people owning all the land. And with evidence of places where the government has proposed activities and they say no one's living there, and they go there only to find that, now X community comes up and says, no, this is our land, it's not vacant. Okay, so I just wanted to go through a few provisions of the law before going into some of the information about land investments themselves. So this is a provision from the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which was signed in 2005, brought to an end the Civil War. I should say that, it set up these, it's sometimes characterized as one country, two systems. So there's the system, Sudan would be allowed to develop on its own lines, and South Sudan was given regional autonomy, its own government, its own legislative capacity, its own army. But it doesn't address the issue of land ownership, whether communities own land or how natural resources are distributed, despite what you'll hear in South Sudan. I think 9 out of 10 government officials will tell you this idea of land belongs to the community is in the CPA. But as this provision shows, it's not intended to address ownership of land and natural resources, and they explicitly kept that idea of community land ownership out. At least, you can read around some provisions and see ideas about it, but it's not explicitly there, despite what people will tell you. The other key point about the CPA is that after a 6-year interim period from 2005 to 2011, South Sudanese were to vote in a referendum on self-determination, which would allow them to decide whether they remained united in Sudan or seceded to form their own country. This vote happened in the vote happened in January 2011, and people opted for independence. The country became the first or the last independent nation on July 9th, 2011, according to the terms of the CPA. So just some other quick spatterings of law here. This is the interim constitution of Southern Sudan, which was in force throughout the interim period, so from 2005 to 2011. You see the language here, there's much more explicit recognition of customary land law, customary rights. So it recognizes customary rights. Customary law is recognized as a source of law along with legislation and other sources. That community land shall be defined, held, managed, and protected by law. So a lot of this rhetoric, although not so much in terms of concrete ideas or about how to move forward with operationalizing these ideas. So after the CPA was passed, there's a question of what law would apply in South Sudan, particularly with respect to the land laws. I think the first instinct was that the pre-existing laws that were enacted by the national government would continue to apply in the regionally autonomous South Sudan. And that provoked a backlash, particularly for the land laws, which were seen as oppressive and one of the instigating factors of the war. So the government quickly, around 2006, 2007, said that all national laws except those relating to land will continue to apply, which now left a big vacuum with respect to land laws, at least in theory, within the legislative framework. And there's then calls for legislation to be developed quickly, and people were squabbling about whether legislation could come first or the policy should be developed first. The outcome of this sort of debate was the Land Act, which was passed in 2009. And there you have a much more explicit recognition of customary law, customary land rights, in this provision giving them equal force and effect in law with freehold or leasehold rights. So at least on this broad statutory level, you're saying that these customary, unwritten customary land rights will be given equal force with any other form of land ownership. Some other provisions, it recognizes traditional authorities, chiefs or other traditional institutions, having the authority to allocate customary land rights for various purposes, including for leaseholds. Sorry, I know you can't read these as I go through them so quickly, but I just want to give you a general overview here. Allocations above a certain size need to have approval of government, and then the ministry at the state level is supposed to check the allocation to see if it has a consensus support within the community, that it's not so big to offend, principles of equity and fairness, and as well as the social environmental impacts. There's also environmental and social impact assessments that are explicitly called for in the Land Act. So it has a number of sort of meaty provisions. Unfortunately, the law is not being applied, in part due to weaknesses in the rule of law, and I think in part due to the problem of land and people not really feeling comfortable entirely with this idea of community land ownership, given the problems that it's raised with the state. As I alluded to there was this discussion about law and policy and how that's framed and what order. And we had this land policy, which actually was developed many years ago and has been sort of making its way through the government and is now in front of the Legislative Assembly, which itself is also quite progressive in many respects. This particular provision is referring to land grabbing, which it defines as the acquisition of land without regards for the interests of existing land rights holders. So it's acknowledging this problem that we associate with land acquisitions that are done without involving people and without respecting the existing rights, be they customary or formal. And then it also calls for a series of legislative reforms which would give increasing specificity to some of these issues. So a Community Land Act that would really clarify what is it that we mean by community land, what are the rights that communities are due, at what point do those rights stop and the government's rights start, particularly with respect to expropriation, in addition to other questions like how registration processes are done, etc. So that's my first sort of half. I hope that gives you a picture of where South Sudan is at in terms of land governance, some of the difficulties of the post-war period. I mean, one can go on for this forever, but if people have other issues that they want to explore there, we can maybe do it in the question and answer. Now I want to transition to this issue of large-scale land investments. Maybe I'll start by giving a brief overview of a recent trend that has been noticed, of sometimes characterized as the land grab. So in which there's been an increase in foreign direct investment into land, particularly in the global south. People have quibbled about the numbers, and there's a great deal of disagreement about how much land is being acquired and under what circumstances. But pretty much everyone can agree that since 2008, 2009, there's been a dramatic increase. When I first started working on these issues in 2009, Sudan was regarded as one among the global hotspots for land acquisitions, in part because it was a huge country and there was a perception that there was a lot of unused land in Sudan. But South Sudan, not much was really known. So we went in starting 2009, 2010, and traveled around the country and tried to find out more about what kinds of investments were happening. And to our surprise, we found that there's actually quite a lot, or maybe not a lot in terms of numbers, but there are large areas of land which were being leased during this period during this interim period between the end of the war and independence. So just to sort of clarify what we mean here by large-scale land investment, we are looking primarily at 5 sectors. So agriculture, of course, biofuels, carbon credits, ecotourism, and forestry. So we're explicitly excluding extractives, no mining projects, no oil projects. And then in terms of size, we're looking at projects which are 500 hectares or larger, so like 5 square kilometers or larger. And we went to each of the 10 states and we met with as many people as we could, and we ended up turning up information on quite a lot of investments that were going on. So in framing it, we tried to be sure to acknowledge the necessity of private investment and the importance of private investment in a place like South Sudan. And clearly the government is not in a position, it's a very new government and has limited capacity. Even the best equipped government may not do such a good job at promoting investment itself. And there's a need for the private sector to step in and to help jumpstart economies. And there's a huge contribution that can be made from private investment. And I think this was something which people are accustomed to, and they're fed a steady diet of the benefits of investment in South Sudan. And in terms of jobs, food security, rural development, this is all things when you talk about investment, you see government officials' eyes light up, and it's as though you're talking about a gift coming from heaven. But what wasn't given as much attention was the risks posed by investment. This is somewhat surprising given the history of the country, and oil exploration in Sudan has been associated with forced displacement and with conflict, and there are a number of large-scale development projects which were initiated which are linked to conflict. including agricultural projects in the border region in Sudan. But despite this history, people weren't really paying much attention to the risks of investment and still aren't paying much attention to the risks of investment. So we wanted also to highlight these risks and to try to start a discussion about what could be done to nudge the trajectory of the country towards more beneficial outcomes and to avoid some of the repeated past mistakes that we've seen with other investments. So this is the data that we brought. It was published in a report called New Frontier in 2011. We found 28 investments across the 10 states. This included both foreign and domestic. In this chart, you can see the company name, the nationality of the company, the business sector, the area of the land that's being sought or acquired, and the stage of the investment. So some of them were finalized, others were only at the stage of an MOU. It was various stages of development. Landowner, and some in the report there's some additional information. Some very large projects. So for instance, here we see this 179,000 hectare project for Norwegian forestry group, 99-year lease. And that was, since that time, it's been finalized and is now operational, although we don't have the final lease agreement to know what the terms are. Nile Trading, this 1 million hectare project, is going to be for a 49-year period, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. A bunch of forestry projects in Western Equatoria State, big ecotourism project by an Emirati company, Al Ain Wildlife, which it's not an exclusive agreement in that they weren't given 1.68 million hectares, 1.68 million square kilometers exclusively, but that's the project area that they were given the right to operate in. And others. So if you want to peek more into this, I could come back to it in the question and answer. But this shows the investments across the 10 states. So the first thing, as we reach the end of this research and we're adding up our numbers, the first sort of aha moment was to see how much land was involved, in part because of some of these exceedingly large areas of projects, but cumulatively, the land area, if we only look at agriculture, biofuels, and forestry, so this excludes the ecotourism venture, is 26,400 square kilometers, which is about the size of Rwanda. Then if you look at all 28 investments, 5.15 million hectares, which is more than 8% of South Sudan's total land area. So a huge area implicated by these investments cumulatively. And again, we're looking here from 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, so 4 years, and at one of the most uncertain times in the history of all of Sudan. The country is on the verge of being broken in half. Conflict is at high levels, at wartime levels in parts of the country. Everyone thought that this was scaring away investors, and the refrain was that, we need to bend over backwards for investment because it's so important for us, without thinking about what types of investors may actually be drawn to this type of environment and may see opportunities there for quick returns. So the size was the first thing that sort of jumped out at us. And then also for those same class of investments, those in forestry, agriculture, biofuels, and foreign-owned companies, if one looks at the land area, you see it's mostly community land. So there's not a process of investors being guided towards the public land holdings that exist in rural areas, even though there are quite a number of government land holdings in rural areas. But rather they're being channeled towards community-owned land, which is all the rest of the rural land. 98% of the land area is community land. This map is showing superimposing the 28 investments over the agroecological zones of South Sudan. And if one sort of adds up the land areas in each zone, it shows that the most demand is in the highest value areas. So this strip along the bottom is the green belt, which has the most forest, most rainfall, most arable land. 25% of this area had been implicated in investments that were either already done or in the process of being developed. And then we have the Nile and Sobat corridor here, which is the area between the Nile and Sobat rivers, where you see 13% of the land area already allocated for investment, including a big farm that's done by an Egyptian equity firm called Citadel Capital. Looking at the progression over time, so this looks at each year how many investments are initiated. The red line is the domestic investments. So there's one investment in 2007, two in 2008, etc. The blue line is the foreign investments, and then the green line is the sum of the two. So we're dealing with quite a small sample here, and I don't want to show a picture and make it look much more authoritative than it is, but at least within this short period, you can see an increasing trend with a dip in 2009. 2009 is when conflict levels in South Sudan surpassed those of Darfur. There are also national elections planned for that time, and it was a very uncertain period. One could surmise that this scared away investment for that period, and then once the uncertainty passed, investments rebounded. If we were to continue past 2011 and this is successful secession of the country, I would have to guess that the line would continue going up. Of course, we don't have the data now to substantiate that, but now all of that uncertainty of the interim period is passed. South Sudan is independent and it's not going to go anywhere. It's been acknowledged by, as a member of the UN, and it's been widely acknowledged as a new nation state. So one can only guess that investments will continue to increase. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the extent to which these companies are working with the existing landholders or are engaging with the existing landholders. Again, the Land Act calls for prior consultation, both with the primary landowners and with pastoralists who may have secondary rights of access, as well as economic and social impact assessments. So first, looking at consultations, we looked at three elements to see if they had been done. First, that they involved a significant cross-section of the community. So it's not enough to just talk with the chief and say that you've consulted the community. You need to involve at least a substantial cross-section. Second, that they were done before the decision was made on the investment. So there are a bunch of projects that had plans to carry out social and impact assessments after the investment agreement had already been given to them, but none that did it beforehand. And then that the community's feedback was incorporated into the investment design, or at least was paid attention to, and if it wasn't incorporated, then a reason was given. So it's not enough just to consult people and then to go and make an agreement without involving them. So there are two companies that made an attempt to do this, that Norwegian firm and this other Canadian, actually this was more of a charitable venture, the CDOS, or at least is framed as a charitable venture. But the rest of the investments foreign investments didn't do any consultations that met those criteria. And none of the investments, foreign or domestic, did impact assessments before the investment agreement, despite this requirement in the law. So I thought here maybe I would show some of these documents. If we start with, this is the agreement, the draft agreement for the Norwegian project, the Green Resources, where they were pursuing a 99-year lease for 179,000 hectares. This is the draft that they had been pursuing for almost 2 years to get signed. It was signed sometime after we did this research. I don't know if this is the final terms of the agreement or not, but in any case, I think it's instructive of the sort of contracts that we're seeing. You know, this first land title agreement, I think, is 4 pages. Very sort of boilerplate language. When we look here at the compensation, it says in here in 4.8, for the purpose of holding and use of the property, Tree Farm Sudan, that's the Norwegian company, Green Resources, a subsidiary of Green Resources, shall pay the Tindilo community the sum of $12,500 per annum. And the community shall present proper accounting, etc. So 179,000 hectares at $12,500 per year. It's about 7 cents per hectare per year. It's essentially free. You couldn't find housing. A month of housing in Juba probably would cost twice as much as this for a whole 179,000 hectares. And then also there's this accompanying agreement, which I'll just go to very briefly. This lays out what they call a community support program, and what that money that they're giving to the community will go towards funding. And among the provisions, when you look here on the roads, it obliges once a year all able men and women from Tindilo, including our permanent staff casual labor, shall contribute 2 days unpaid work on the road leading into this area. So they've thrown into the agreement also this requirement that the landholders, the people who are given this huge area of land, also donate their unpaid time. So I don't mean to, caricature this agreement, but it shows sort of the contracting side of it, which is a big part in terms of the weakness of the contracts and the lack of legally binding language, the lack of specificity, despite the scale of the land that's being transferred, despite the length of the term of the lease. And then also I was going to show these, there have been several instances in which these agreements are made involving perhaps a few individuals from the community, very often just with the government and without the community's knowledge. And then the community becomes aware of the agreement, and then their response typically is very interesting and often very effective. This is the Million Hectare Project, which actually it's an American company called Nile Trading and Development, actually owned by a former U.S. ambassador and his son. So I went out to this community actually about a month before they wrote this letter and trying to find out if people had heard about it. And I had the lease agreement on my iPad and I showed it to them, and no one had heard about it. So I sat down with about 10 chiefs and sub-chiefs, and we talked for the afternoon. They're all shocked that something like this could happen without their knowledge. And then a month later, so I went just before independence, like a couple weeks before independence. This letter was written, I guess, less than a month after independence, in which they, unanimously and with strong terms condemn or disavow or deny the land lease. And they go through sort of some details about how it's illegitimate. Another interesting provision here is that you see that despite this being done without their consent, despite the fact that the company has, they're claiming rights to minerals, to natural gas, to do agriculture, to forestry, everything under the sun, and without very much of an established track record in any of these sectors. Nonetheless, the community, although they disavow and deny the lease, they say, but if you're to come nicely and if you ask nicely, we can work something out. And here in Provision 3, they say they welcome any investment to the area as long as it follows the proper channels. So I think that tells something about the desperation of people, whether we're talking about Tindilo community or Mukaya community. These are in very remote areas. 8 months out of the year, they're totally inaccessible because the road turns to mud, and unless you have a tractor, you can't get in and out. There's no cell phone reception, so you need satellite phones even to communicate. And here comes an investment, and they're promising jobs and development and all of this. And so people are very keen to attract investment. And I think that's something that people must be aware of in terms of advocacy and in terms of how one approaches it, to realize that this does mean something for people and to think about how one could work out more positive outcomes. Lastly, I'll try to wrap it up here. This is another letter from a community in Boma where that Emirati ecotourism venture was located. Again, you see here that at this last sentence, they say, moreover, the community participation in decision-making with regard to project implementation was completely excluded and ignored. So this real sentiment about not being involved and about the process being non-inclusive and that being their grounds for opposition. And then they go into several different sort of specific problems that they have with the investment agreement. So before I close, I want to say something about viability. So I think this is a very important note to keep in mind, that these deals a lot of them are crapshoots, and more broadly, even in Africa, if I'm not mistaken, there's a study by the World Bank in 2009 that found only that 70% of these deals fall through and don't actually materialize. And in South Sudan, I'd say, we're probably looking at more like 90% of these deals don't materialize. There's actually a funny, I don't know if you call it anecdote or whatever, by the Minister of Agriculture, who said that investors are like clouds in the sky that look like they want to rain, but they never actually drop the rain. Meaning, I think there's a steady supply of people who come with proposals and ideas that never materialize. So that's something to keep in mind. But then also when one couples it with people's eagerness to attract investment and their willingness to accept almost anything and to give land away for free just on the hopes that someone will come and do something, it also sort of introduces other dynamics relevant to that issue of viability. So just before we open the floor for discussion, I want to highlight a few broader themes and initiatives that are proposed, which are relevant to sort of land governance and how it responds to an increase in investment in this type of environment. The first is the term community. In South Sudan, it's used very commonly, and people know what they mean. It can be used, basically it's synonymous with tribe, but can also refer to sub-tribal groupings and various other things. But when it comes to policy, that's where we see a lot of fuzziness and difficulty in sort of knowing exactly what are we talking about, both in terms of sort of definitionally, because, of course, communities, depending where they are very often not homogeneous groupings. They can have minority groups living within the territory, migrants, IDPs in South Sudan. There's large displaced populations, and the way in which the interests of primary landholders relate to those of other groups, I think, is something that gets lost when you talk about community at a broader level. But then also in a very practical sense, how does one interact with that? If I'm an investor and I want to come and do a deal in a given area, who do I negotiate with? How do I know if I'm talking to the right person? How do I know that I've reached an agreement that can be enforced? So the idea of how can a community enter into contracts? How can it sue or be sued? How can it represent itself is something which is lacking. And we had some interesting discussions earlier about trust models and various other sorts of ideas which could be used to help operationalize some of these concepts. Another initiative is that of registering community lands. So according to the Land Act, community land rights are recognized whether they're registered or not. But there's also a process that's being called for to register, survey, and map community lands and register the rights in those lands. It hasn't started yet, but there's a lot of discussion about how to approach it. And I think there's a potential benefit in that, if one leaves these systems totally just to their own devices, what we'll see in a very short period of time is that they'll be absorbed into cities. People will be displaced, or they'll sell off their rights, or land which was once thought to be owned in perpetuity and would be given from generation to generation to generation will be given off for various other purposes. And we've seen that happen in other contexts. And I think that's one danger of thinking that customary land rights can continue as they are without any sort of state protection or state recognition. But on the other hand, we've seen in other contexts how registration can serve as a means of alienating land. And if you look in Kenya, the formalization of lands was used as a way to appropriate, for elites to appropriate lands. So there's that double side to it, and the question of how does one proceed with formalization, I think, is a huge issue. Then sort of more broadly, in South Sudan inherited this very egalitarian, sort of equal distribution of resources, and that everyone had access to land. Under customary land tenure, there's land which is set apart for families and for individuals, and people, it's very much a social safety net in that everyone has a right to land within their particular ancestral homelands. But now we're seeing this process of land concentration, both in terms of investments, which is sort of happening in this virtual way, but even more, I think, dramatically is in terms of South Sudanese who are jockeying for position, trying to acquire land, who now understand that the country has emerged from this lengthy war, and if they're able to acquire land, that land will be increasing in value. So this issue of land concentration is something which I think is happening fast in a very sort of dramatic way and fast way. And in terms of policy, I think it's incumbent upon the government to sort of think about the implications of that and what might we be losing by opening the floodgates to investment and leaving sort of customary land rights, to be preyed upon by different individuals. And in thinking about that, just as a last point, the sort of different calculations between the foreign companies and the sort of domestic companies, sort of interesting to note how the foreign companies clearly come in very often with short time horizons, are looking to turn around and make profit as soon as possible, and are cutting as many margins as possible. Whereas for the South Sudanese, I think they're playing a much longer term game. You have a lot of military officers, political leaders who are acquiring land, often posing as the state and acquiring land for ostensibly public purposes, when really you see that it's more of a private initiative. And those two games and how they sort of feed off one another, I think is something also to consider. So I haven't really wrapped it up with a nice bow, and I don't know. I tried to be optimistic, but I think one sort of also has to be realistic and sort of deal with what's confronting you. So I'd hope I didn't come across as too pessimistic, and everyone now is saying, why did we let South Sudan become independent? Because it's definitely not how I feel. And when all is said and done, if the country is moving in a good direction, but along the way, there's all sorts of hurdles that have to be overcome. So I think I'll stop with that. And